What famous person did you meet, not realizing who they were until later? Not me, but my wife and I worked at a tiny little produce store in Vermont during our teen years. Paul Bettany came in the store and my wife was the only one who knew who he was. At least 50 people in the store. She said he came up to the counter looking for a place to buy some Crocs early 2000s when Crocs were the new fad. She nervously asked for his autograph and he just nodded and she handed him a piece of scrap paper. She still has it to this day. I didn't even know who he was until she told me what movies he was in. She watched Handmaid's Tale a lot, that's how she recognized him. I'm a professional musician and had a gig with John Patrick Lowry, the voice of the sniper in TF2 and many other voice-over roles. Had a series of incredible conversations with him and after he mentioned he was a professional actor I googled him. Dude is one of the smartest, kindest, most grounded people I have ever met. His wife, Ellen, voice of Gladys from the Portal series, independently came to one of my shows too and was super sweet and complimentary. I also had no idea who she was until I googled her. Feels good to have super accomplished people dig your work though. Served a sandwich to the lead singer of Blink-182. To me he just looked like an emo dude and was buying a sandwich, pleasant and normal and just a customer. After he walked away, this hipster guy I worked with ran up to me hyperventilating asking if I knew who that was. Also got to serve Drew Brees, and at the same place after one of my shifts I got in line to get food and I noticed the dude in front of me had the fattest, most diamond-studded Rolex I'd ever seen. Didn't see his face until he turned to leave. It was Barry Bonds. All three in the same restaurant in the same year. Not me but my mom. She was in a grocery store and saw someone who looked familiar. At the time she helped run the town's soccer league for kids in middle school, so she would interact with a lot of people. She couldn't think of where she knew him from, so assumed she recognized his face as one of the parents from soccer. So she went up and said hi, asked how he was doing and then went back to her shopping. It wasn't until she was sitting in the car that she realized she had been talking to Peter Gallagher. She did say he looked slightly confused during their conversation. I work on and off in the film industry but have zero interest in celebrities, so pretty regularly I have been working on set or standing in a Lunchcraft truck line chatting with someone and after they leave someone will say, "Dude, do you know who that was?" And it was some hotshot director or famous person who I didn't recognize. I had someone almost get really hurt when they sprinted full speed past a grid pipe I was carrying. No running on set people and I started to rip them a new one when my colleagues stopped me. It was one of the cast late for a shooting. Duke Cunningham. Politician here in California. Met him in about 2003, 2004, can't remember which. I was about 9 or 10. I was with my dad and sister and my sister 14 or 15 at the time was mad dogging him, and he asked, "Do you have a question, young lady?" And she said, "Yeah, are you a crook?" He replied, "I'm an upstanding member of Congress." "Why would you say that?" She said, "Well, my dad says all politicians are crooks." He looked at my dad and asked if that was true, and my dad said, "Prove me wrong." Dude got caught in a big scandal about a year or two later. When I was a kid, I lived in Hawaii and my family somehow knew people who knew Ben Stiller. He came over to our house for dinner with our family friends and my parents were both trying to hype me up. Well, I was around 7 years old at the time and had no idea who he was, so I basically didn't react at all. I remember my parents saying things like, "So you know who this is?" And my response was along the lines of, "Hi, nice to meet you," and not much else. Felt really stupid when I watched my first Ben Stiller movie later in life and immediately recognized him. I was leaving a restaurant with my family in Austria back when I was 13. I walked in the way of a bunch of guys going into the restaurant and we did that little shuffle that people do when they're trying to get out of each other's way. This dude with black hair and eyeliner and a weird accent laughed and said we're dancing in the street. Found out later that night it was The Cure, and that little quip was from Robert Smith and they were grabbing dinner before a big outdoor show the night in Vienna. Listened to it from my hotel room, pretty neat encounter. Does Jordan Burroughs count as a famous person? I spent 7 or so hours flying from Europe to Kazakhstan sitting next to the guy in the economy class. We had a nice chat. He told me he was going to participate in a wrestling competition in Astana and was representing the United States. I was completely oblivious, until I saw him on the TV the next day. The stranger part is, I'm Kazakh and I did some wrestling while at the uni. I should have known him. And the wrestling competition in Astana was the World Championship. This is how detached I was. Dacre Montgomery from Stranger Things Elvis. I was at a party with friends at a house in the jungle. We had a chat about shit, I asked him what he did and he said he was an actor. I started giving him shit about being a B-grade Zac Efron pretty boy and he had a bit of a chuckle. Didn't realize he was an actual actor until he introduced me to Baz Luhrmann. Turned out the whole cast of Elvis was there minus Tom Hanks. Austin Butler is a bit of a dick. Baz is cool, Dacre was down to earth and cool as shit. He seemed to dig the fact I had no idea who he was. I was at the airport sitting at a bar top table eating a sandwich a few years back. This tough-looking dude, puffy ears, broad shoulders, with hat and shades was sitting opposite me. His back was to the concourse, I could see everyone walk by and double-take the dude. He finished his food, picked up a UFC duffel from the floor where I hadn't seen it and said thanks for letting me eat in peace, it's much harder to do that these days, and he left. Still have no clue who he was. I'm guessing some UFC fighter. But really, no clue. Back around 2000 I was walking my dog before work in my suite, but on the larger sized dog went up and sniffed this tiny dog a couple was walking. The toddler in a stroller got a bit upset and I said something about her dog being fine, that he's a really nice boy. I then proceeded to have a brief conversation with the dad about my rescue, followed by we've got to get moving because I'm going to be late for work. As I walked away, I did a double take and realized it was Ethan Hawke, Uma Thurman, and the toddler was probably Maya Hawke, Taylor Swift. In about 2009 or 2010. I was a truck driver, stopped at a rest stop to take a break. This big motor coach pulls in and a young lady and I guess her mom got out to use the restroom. I held the door for her, she said thank you. I was still out walking around when they came out. They were laughing and she said hi again. I was parked next to them and told them to drive safe. The next day I saw a truck with that same girl's picture on the side of it. It said Taylor Swift. Prior to that, I had never heard of her. Met Margot Kidder, played Lois Lane in Superman, in a bar in Livingston Mount to buy my sis-in-law and I a beer. We were all chatting, and she asked my Sil, do you want my autograph? Puzzled, Sil goes why? I laughed so hard. I knew who she was. Also was playing a drinking game with some randos and turns out one was Ron Stryker. He wrote I come from a land down under by men at work. Met Mario Batali, chef at the hotel I worked at. He was whiny, needy and a jerk. He left a tooth and a flattened penny as a tip. Olivia Holt. She's so sweet. Very polite and bubbly and nice. Did not realize that she was a Disney star till months later. James Marsters as well. I thought he looked familiar but I couldn't place where I've seen him. When I told my friends they basically screamed at me for not realizing who he was. I like to clarify that they screamed in a nice OMG I cannot believe you don't know him kitty, you're such an idiot way. That's also when they realized I have not seen Buffy and set up a Buffy marathon just for me. Jim Irsay. I used to do hair in Indianapolis. He stopped in on a whim to see if he could get his neckline cleaned up before leaving for a trip and I did it. He was very nice and tipped well. At one point during the conversation he asked if I was into football. I think he knew at that point that I didn't know who he was. I told him I was more into basketball lol. It wasn't until the next day when my boss, who happened to be a huge Colts fan, was going through credit card slips and freaked out, that I learned who he was. I was at a gas station and some fancy car pulls up on the opposite pump. The driver gets out, starts pumping gas and asks me how far it is to the airport. I told him about 15 minutes away. He opens the car door and says, "Hey Kenny, we're only 15 minutes away." Kenny and another guy get out of the car to stretch a bit and are both sipping coffee. He says hey to me. I say hey back. As I'm driving away my wife says, "Was that Kenny G?" She looks online and sure enough, he was in town the previous night for a concert. I had a conversation with a short, gorgeous American redhead backstage at a Bauhaus concert in Europe in 1998. It was kind of nice to have a conversation with another American because I felt sort of out of place. About 2 minutes later, someone came through and said, "Has anybody seen Debbie Harry?" And that's when it clicked. In my defense, I had never seen her without blonde hair and never would have expected to see her at another band show on a different continent unless Blondie was touring on the same bill. Eddie Money. I was working an outdoor fast food concession at the Boardwalk in Santa Cruz, California when a guy came up and got some food. The next woman in line, who was obviously with him, asked me if I knew who Eddie Money was. Of course I did. I was a big fan of his music. This was a few decades ago. Then she just paid for her food and walked away. It took a few seconds to realize that the man ahead of her had, in fact, been Eddie Money. I didn't recognize him in flip-flops, shorts and a tank top. I met a guy outside Weta Workshop in Wellington. My tour guide introduced us and I shook his hand. He asked me how I was liking New Zealand and other small talk. I told him how I was a fan of Lord of the Rings films and was on a tour. Went on my merry little way. Tour guide was stoked. Said you just met Sir Richard Taylor. I had no idea who that is. Get back to the hotel that night. The guy's on the cover of the magazine in the room. I was at Weta Cave and had met the freaking co-founder. About 10 or so years ago I was out on my friend's Bucks night. As a gift, my friend's father-in-law had gotten us on the guest list for some high-end function near where we were kicking off. The last thing I remembered before waking up in the taxi was 5 shots being lined up in front of me. That's when my friend asks, "So what were you and Heath Ledger talking about?" Turns out it was a premiere party for the film Ned Kelly and several people had spotted myself and Heath deep in conversation. I used to manage a concession stand at Lambeau Field for a volunteer group. Nonprofits work the stands and make a percentage of sales. After one game we wrapped up and took the elevator down. Our stand was near the boxes and on the elevator ride down, the door opened and a man and woman got on. After we got back to the locker room, people on my crew were freaking out. I guess it was Alex Rodriguez and whatever girl he was dating. I don't follow baseball so I didn't notice, man shrugging.